Hello again. This is part 2 of our biography about Andrew Jackson. And if you were on the Zoom meeting yesterday, I did tell you a little bit about a time break in between one of these pages and the next pages in this book when Andrew Jackson actually attacked some of the Native Americans in Florida and actually ended up being given the governorship of Florida, but he was only governor for 6 months. And then I also, there was a part where he ran for president against John Quincy Adams, and there were not enough votes all over the whole country for one candidate to get a majority, and they actually tied, and Congress had to choose, and Congress chose John Quincy Adams instead of Andrew Jackson for president. But then we get to the point where he runs for president again and he actually is elected. So that's where I'm going to start and finish up part 2 of our biography. Andrew Jackson ran for president in 1824. He just missed winning the election against John Quincy Adams. Andrew and his supporters were furious because, of course, Congress chose John Quincy Adams, and so he didn't like that. Andrew Jackson didn't like losing anything to anyone. Here's a nice portrait in here that was painted about with him, and you can see him there on his horse. I think it's kind of a nice little view of the horse. The horse has got a little bit of personality, throwing its head over to the side a little bit. Thought that was cute. Andrew Jackson and his friends didn't waste a moment getting ready for the next election. In 1828, Andrew ran for president against John Quincy Adams again. It was a fierce battle. Both sides insulted the other's candidate. So both sides were like slinging mud. That's what they called it. They said things that weren't always true and were often hurtful. Yeah, that's kind of been going on for a long time, hasn't it? When the election was over, Andrew Jackson had won. Farmers, shop owners, settlers, and other everyday people felt that they could trust Jackson because he was the first president to come from a poor frontier family. That's why he's called the first common president, and actually the first modern president. Andrew never forgot the common people who voted for him, and he always tried to keep them in mind when he made his decisions. And unfortunately, just before Andrew began his new job as president, a terrible thing happened. His wife, Rachel, died. In 1829, a sad Andrew Jackson traveled to the White House alone. He ended up serving 2 4-year terms as president. And in one of the sources that I read from, it said that all of the hurtful things that had been said during the campaign led to Rachel's bad health. I mean, she really took all that very, very hard. And so that was one of the causes, they say, of her death, is the fact that she suffered so much during that campaign, and all the people saying hurtful things and being ugly and that kind of thing. Andrew Jackson was one of the most powerful leaders in the United States had ever had. During his time as president, Andrew made many important decisions. Some were very good, but some were very bad. One of the worst ones was supporting a law called the Indian Removal Act. And if you will notice on this afternoon's social studies part, I have included a link there for you to watch a short video about the Trail of Tears, which was the result of the Indian Removal Act. By the 1830s, thousands of Americans were moving west, settling the land and hoping to find a better life. A lot of this land, however, belonged to American Indians. Many settlers of the time viewed these Indians as being in the way, as well as dangerous. Andrew Jackson and other members of the government shared this viewpoint. Now, in today's world, we often call this racial profiling. You think someone's bad just because of their race. And so this was going on back during this time of the Indian Removal Act. I mean, they were basically racial profiling. That's what they were doing. With President Jackson's support, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. Its goal was to remove all Indians living east of the Mississippi River to lands west of the river. Eventually, the United States forced thousands of Creek Indians, Choctaw, Black Hawk, Sauk, S-A-U-K, Seminole, and Cherokee from their lands, often after bloody battles. Not everyone supported the Indian Removal Act, but most people didn't seem to care about the cruel treatment of the American Indians. That's probably the heart of the matter. Most people just didn't care. Here's a painting that was done from that Indian Removal Act time. It was very, very, very sad times. Andrew Jackson was never afraid to challenge anyone or anything that he felt might harm the United States. When he learned that the powerful Second National Bank of the United States was being run by just a few wealthy businessmen, he became angry. These men were able to control most of the money in the United States without anyone watching over them. They could easily use public money for their own private gain. Also, these bankers never helped poor working people who needed loans to start up new businesses and improve their farms. Andrew Jackson hated the Second National Bank so much, he forced it to go out of business. Once, when the state of South Carolina refused to go along with the national law, President Jackson became really angry. He said that the states couldn't break laws decided by the U.S. government. If they began doing this, the country could fall apart. Foreshadowing. You know what's coming, right? Civil War. You know who was majorly involved in the start of the Civil War? South Carolina. We'll get to that. The president then said that the United States would go to war with South Carolina if it didn't change its mind. Fortunately, a compromise was worked out, and an early civil war was avoided. So see, at that point, we could have been having a civil war, and South Carolina would be in the lead of that, but they worked it out, held it off for now. We know we get into a civil war, and South Carolina is at the forefront. And then, the last page, Andrew Jackson was the first president to work hard for everyday people. He paved the way for people to take part in the U.S. government, even if they weren't born wealthy and well-connected. After he retired as president, Andrew Jackson spent time taking care of his plantation in Tennessee. And if you look up online, the Hermitage, capital Hermitage, that was the name of his plantation in Tennessee. It's kind of right outside Nashville. It was a big cotton plantation. It's kind of interesting. If you look on that website, you can kind of see pictures of it. He died there at his plantation in 1845 at the age of 78. And that's kind of a later picture of how he looked. It's interesting that I think somewhere in here it talks about how during this time of conflict with the Second National Bank, in January of 1835, Jackson paid off the entire national debt. The only time in U.S. history that has ever been accomplished. So I guess there were some good things there. He actually, a little bit more information about the conflict with South Carolina. He did preside over the nation's first secession crisis, Secession, which is pulling away from the government, when South Carolina declared the right to nullify federal tariff or tax legislation because it hurt the state's financial interests. Jackson introduced a force bill, with capital letters, to Congress that would allow him to send federal troops to South Carolina to enforce laws and prevent secession. The bill was delayed long enough for a compromise tariff or tax bill to make its way through Congress. So on March the 1st, 1833, both bills were passed, and secession and civil war were narrowly avoided. President Abraham Lincoln would later cite or quote Jackson's actions during the nullification crisis in his attempts to prevent secession and the Civil War. But of course, Abraham Lincoln was not successful like Jackson was. Jackson also carries the dubious distinction of being the first president to be physically attacked in office in May of 1833, and the first to have an assassination attempt against him in office, which was January of 1835. The misfire of both pistols wielded by his assailants has only added to his legend. So both times when he was attacked, the pistols did not fire. Jackson also, at one point in his presidency, dismissed his entire presidential cabinet, except for the Postmaster General. This controversy caused him to rely heavily on a group of trusted advisors, which were not officially his cabinet, but his opponents called this group his, and this is in quotes and capital letters, his kitchen cabinet, because they were unofficial and seemingly a group that would like meet in his kitchen. So he has quite a few things that made him a memorable president. We'll continue with part 3 tomorrow, which will be from this other source, Lives of the Presidents, Fame, Shame, and What the Neighbors Thought. It's the title of this book. So anyway, bye.